The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Rachelle gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Rachelle. This week we're looking at how science is changing our relationship with the animal world. A little later, guest host Rachelle Saunders talks to futurist George Dvorsky, director of the Rights of Non-Human Persons program at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. They'll discuss the legal and scientific efforts to expand basic rights to animals other than humans. But first, let's learn how biotechnology is expanding the possibilities of animals as recreation and as resources. We'll look at technologies like genetic engineering and cloning and their use in livestock, cross-species organ donation, and even customizing our pets. I'm here today with Emily Anthes, science journalist and author whose writing you might have seen in the New York Times, Wired, or Scientific American. We'll be talking about her new book, Frankenstein's Cat, Cuddling Up to Biotech's Brave New Beasts. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Now, I follow science news pretty closely, but your book introduced me to some, honestly, fairly mind-blowing animal modification. I'd heard of the glow-in-the-dark cat, but I did not realize that we could actually buy glowfish now.
Yep, that's right. And that's something that surprised me a little bit, sort of in general, across all the things I was exploring, is that I knew scientists were doing some pretty interesting and radical things in their lab, but I didn't realize how many of these technologies were starting to trickle out to the public. What you're talking about are these fish called glowfish, which have been genetically modified to, fluoresce in 5 different colors: bright red, orange, green, etc. And they're on the market in the US as pets. They're in a lot of pet store chains. They're just $5 or $6, and really they're the first animal biotechnology product that's easily accessible to, anyone with $5.
But they don't really glow per se, do they?
Well, it depends what you mean by glow. So don't work the same way that like glow-in-the-dark stickers work. Those technically are known as luminescent, and these are fluorescent. So what happens is when they're under a blue or a black light, they give off these bright colors. But it's not like if you turn off all the lights in the room, they suddenly light the room up. It doesn't work quite like that.
How did they make them?
This comes from borrowing genes from marine organisms. There are a bunch of different marine critters that sort of naturally fluoresce, most prominently jellyfish, but also sea anemones and coral. And they do that because their bodies make fluorescent proteins. And so scientists can take the gene that codes for, say, green fluorescent protein, and they inject it into a zebrafish embryo. The zebrafish, as it develops, then its own body starts making these fluorescent proteins, and they start giving off these bright colors. Since the gene is actually incorporated into their own genomes, once you get sort of a starter population of glowfish, you can just breed them because they pass the fluorescence genes on to their offspring.
Now, again, we can buy these fish, but we've spoken quite a bit on Skeptically Speaking about the policies and legislation around genetically modified organisms. And from what I understand, it is tremendously difficult to get approval to do research like this, much less sell it commercially. So what makes glowfish different?
Well, it's not as hard to get approval to do research. A lot of scientists use zebrafish in the lab for all sorts of purposes, partly because they develop quickly and also because the embryos are transparent. So if you're studying development, you can really watch these creatures develop. And scientists were the ones who first started putting these fluorescent proteins in zebrafish because if, say, they tagged all of the respiratory cells with this protein, you could actually watch the respiratory system develop bright green as the fish was developing. So that's been going on in labs for a while. The company that decided to market these as pets sort of realized that there was no real legislation at the time in the US that covered pets. You know, the FDA had thought a lot about what to do about genetically modified foods because that was clearly coming down the pike, but they hadn't really thought about pets. So the guy who runs this company sort of knew that there might be some outcry and some potential controversy. So to his credit, he took it upon himself to approach the FDA and say, look, here's what I want to do. Here's how the fish are made. Do you have any problems with it? And the FDA sort of did an unofficial review. They looked at a lot of data, and then they essentially issued a statement that said, these fish aren't meant to be eaten, and they're not likely to be a risk to the environment, so we sort of declined to intervene, is basically what they said.
Well, do we generally kind of hear the same kinds of concerns around GM animals as we do around GM agriculture?
Yes, in general. You know, there are different categories of concerns. So one is, you know, how will it affect humans who might eat the animals? And in the case of these glowfish, that doesn't really apply, but there are other cases in which it applies. Then there's the other practical concern, which is what might happen if this animal got loose, if this lab creature made its way into the wild, would it affect ecosystems? And then there are just more philosophical concerns about, you know, is this wrong because it's unnatural or because it's meddling? Are we playing God? And those questions are a little harder to answer with data.
So I guess then what is the response from the people who are pursuing this kind of research to those kind of questions?
Well, it depends on the particular case you're talking about. I think that the first two questions are really important questions. They're very practical concerns about risk to humans and risk to the environment. And usually scientists in those cases respond with data. You can't ever be 100% sure that there are no risks, but you can do studies about sort of what might happen if certain fish got loose. And in the case, say, of the most widely known case of a GM animal is the Aqua Advantage salmon that's before the FDA right now. And so in that case, the company who makes them has taken a lot of steps to try and prevent them from ever escaping into the wild. So companies and entrepreneurs sort of can take those steps. I think it's a harder dialogue to have when you talk about the more philosophical concerns because that's not something that you can present a table of data about. It's about values and issues that people might not all agree upon.
So would you say that, I guess for all intents and purposes, that glowfish is just a really cool toy, or is there something more valuable there?
Yes, glowfish as they exist in the pet store are just a fun toy, but actually one of the reasons they were created is kind of a cool story. The scientist who the company licensed the technology from was trying to essentially create living pollution detectors. So his idea is to have these fish that say will turn bright green or bright red if the water they're swimming in is polluted. And so that's why he first started working in this area. And that lab has actually gone on to do that. The fish aren't in use, but they've shown that you can have fish that if there's a certain pollutant in the water in which they're swimming, the fish will fluoresce. And so there are some interesting real-world applications of the technology, but sort of the glowfish as they exist in the pet store are just sort of fun toys.
And I believe one of your footnotes actually said that I guess another group had figured out a different way to use goldfish to figure out pollution. Basically throw it in the water and if it dies, probably polluted.
Yes, that is the more rudimentary method of testing for polluted water.
This is Skeptically Speaking, and my guest is Emily Anthes, author of Frankenstein's Cat, Cuddling Up to Biotech's Brave New Beasts. So there's definitely biotech research that does fall clearly into the category of this will help humans, not merely entertain them. So you wrote about the field of farming with a PH.
The PH comes from the word pharmaceutical, so it is essentially turning livestock into living, breathing pharmaceutical factories. And the idea from this comes from sort of the recognition that some of the proteins that sort of the human body makes naturally, things like hormones or Insulin, clotting factors, those proteins are all really valuable in medicine. They're used essentially as drugs, but it's hard to produce them on an industrial scale. They're complicated and they have to be folded just right and have sort of these right sugars put on them. And our bodies are really good at doing that, but it's harder to do it with machines or cells. Scientists realize, though, that dairy animals like goats and cows are experts at making complicated proteins. Their udders fill with milk that is just chock full of proteins. So the idea is that you would take, say, a human gene for an important clotting factor, and you put it in a goat. And if you put it under the control of just the right genetic switch, then what will happen is when the goat lactates, her udder will fill with milk, and some of the proteins in that milk are actually this human clotting factor. So then you can purify the milk and process it and basically extract this medicine from the milk.
Which is pretty much all over amazing. So is this method being widely used then?
It's not being widely used. So far, there is only one drug on the market that is produced that way, which is in itself pretty amazing. The EU approved it in 2006 and the US approved it in 2009. And it is one of these sort of clotting factors, and it's for people who have a specific genetic disorder. So there's one drug on the market, but it's a really hot area of research. I think there will be more drugs on the market. We'll see more of them. There are a lot of labs working on this.
So why isn't it being used more widely right now?
I think it's just that it hasn't been enough time yet. I mean, scientists didn't really start playing around in this area until the 80s, and then the first successes sort of came in the late 80s, early 90s, and then by the time you go through the regulatory process, it just takes time. I don't think it's for lack of potential. It's just sort of hasn't caught up yet with what's possible.
Well, what else are we seeing in the field of farming?
The big one, the most widely sort of researched one is dairy animals, but there's some other interesting ideas. Some researchers are looking at chickens. So the idea is that the chickens would lay eggs and you would purify the egg protein and get drugs out of that. There's some other potential ideas, like maybe modify silkworms so that their silk has proteins in it. Some people have talked about blood and semen, which is a little grosser to think about. But I think the idea is that sort of any bodily fluid you can get a mammal or an animal to make is potentially open to alteration in this way.
And so, it being a theme of this interview, in part, I'm sure that not everybody wants to promote this kind of research.
No, and you see some of the same objections I was talking about earlier, but you also, in these cases, get some legitimate questions about animal welfare as well. So, how does putting this foreign gene in the animal's body affect them? In the case of these goats, at least the ones that have been studied, they haven't found any ill effects. And partly that's because scientists have figured out how to sort of limit expression of this gene just to the mammary gland. So they're really just making this human protein in their milk and not everywhere. But, there are legitimate questions. As much as you think it out in theory, it's experimental and you don't know exactly how an animal might respond.
Well, in your book, you seem to boil down the argument to basically animals having intrinsic value versus animals having instrumental value. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right. And that's not a new debate. That's something that animal rights activists have long talked about, which is that, some people say that animals are valuable on their own. Their lives have value for reasons that go beyond how they can be useful to us. And I happen to agree that's absolutely true. Instrumental value is when we sort of use an animal solely as a tool. So as a source of meat, or in this case, as a source of drugs. And that's not a new debate. But what's interesting is that genetic engineering gives us ways to make animals even more useful. And in some ways that's good for us, but you could legitimately argue that making animals more useful means we're going to be using them more. It sort of magnifies their role as resources for humans instead of just being worthy of their own lives on their own.
Well, let's talk about organ donation. Scientists have been trying for years to transplant animal organs into humans. So tell us about that.
So it's, easy to see why that would be appealing. That, well, at least from a medical perspective.
Right.
There's a shortage of human organ donors worldwide. And so, it sounds like this great silver bullet. If we could just take organs from animals and put them into humans, like that would solve the problem or alleviate it at least. So some of the earliest experiments were done with apes, which makes sense because they're sort of the closest to us, evolutionarily and genetically. The patients didn't always do well. The big problem, of course, with organ donation is rejection, and the body, the immune system, is really good at recognizing things that are foreign in the body. And so it would see, say, a heart from a baboon and say, this doesn't belong to us, and would attack the organ. And, the patients would usually die. They did not do well. Recently, scientists have been focused more on pigs instead of apes, and that's partly for ethical reasons. It's become sort of taboo to talk about apes as organ donors because of their cognitive capacities. But, you have the same basic problem. The body rejects a pig organ, and in particular, pig organs are covered with these special sugars, and our own organs don't have them. So as soon as you put a pig organ in a human patient, the immune system sees these sugars and knows that it's a foreign organ, and the same problem attacks it, rejects it. Scientists are tackling this problem using genetic engineering. So they've managed to create pigs in which they've essentially, it's called knocked out, but deactivate the gene that codes for these special sugars. So suddenly you have pigs making organs that essentially pass more easily as human organs. So the idea is that this is just one step. It's not going to create perfect organs for humans, but that if you make the right genetic tweaks to a pig, you could essentially create a pig that has human-like organs inside, and they can be sort of harvested en masse and given to human patients who need new organs.
So again, there are, of course, people who I would say dislike the entire idea of using animal tissues in humans and human tissues in animals because it is kind of weird.
Yes. One objection is just sort of this idea about the sanctity of species and how maybe it's wrong to cross that. But, some of those lines have already been crossed.
Right.
So it's become a common procedure to put a pig valve in heart patients. That's commonly done. And I would say at least that doesn't make that patient any more of, a pig than not having a heart valve. And it also gets back to that question of the instrumental use of animals. It's sort of the most vivid example of instrumental use of animals. We would literally be creating and raising pigs purely so we could take them apart and put their organs in our own species. That's an extreme thing to do, even if you understand the medical benefits that could come from it.
And it actually gets even more odd when we're talking about something that you mentioned in the book, moving brain cells between species. Are we doing that?
We are, and there's actually just a study that it's not in the book because it's sort of hot off the presses. It was just a few weeks ago, but scientists can take stem cells from humans, and these are essentially the cells that are capable of turning into all sorts of tissues, and you inject it into an early embryo of, say, a sheep. And as the sheep fetus develops, some of the human stem cells do their thing and develop into liver cells and heart cells and brain cells. And you end up with a sheep when it's born and, as it grows up, that has some sheep cells and some human cells. Recently, scientists just did this with brain cells, so they actually created mice that had some human cells in their brains. And that's sort of even crazier to think about.
We totally live in the future.
Yes.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and we'll be right back with more of Emily Anthes, author of Frankenstein's Cat, after this.
Skeptically Speaking is rebroadcast on a number of fine radio stations. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm Desiree Schell, and I'm joined by Emily Anthes, science journalist and author of Frankenstein's Cat, Cuddling Up to Biotech's Brave New Beasts. Now, most of us have heard of Dolly, the cloned sheep, but that was years ago, and cloning has come a remarkably long way, correct?
That's right. It's still very much an experimental technology. There's still a lot of kinks to be worked out, but I was surprised myself to discover just how many animals have been cloned. I mean, hundreds, thousands even, more than I thought it was maybe a dozen, but it turned out to be a lot more than that.
And it really seems to have taken off, basically because one guy just really wanted a new dog, or his old dog, actually.
Right. Yes. That's sort of the birth of pet cloning, which I guess was probably inevitable after Dolly was born. And this was a man named John Sperling. He was anonymous at the time, but his identity has since come out, and multimillionaire, maybe even billionaire, actually, don't recall. But he had this mutt named Missy, border collie mutt, and thought she was a wonderful dog. And as soon as he read about Dolly, he got interested in the idea of having Missy cloned. And he approached some reproductive scientists. He actually sort of recruited from all over the U.S., but picked a team at Texas A&M University and launched what they called the Missy-plicity Project. It's hard to say. The other thing I learned in researching this book is that animal cloners love puns. There are lots of puns in company names and pet names. And in any case, he funded a $3 million project to get scientists to clone Missy. It was harder than they expected. It took years, and they eventually abandoned Texas A&M and had to get it done in Korea. It's sort of a long saga, but was ultimately successful. And along the way, of course, there was publicity about this project, and other pet owners got interested. As one of the men who started this company said, millions of people believe they have a 1 in a million pet. So everyone wanted to get their pet cloned, and they launched a company, essentially, that would provide pet cloning to the public.
Let it be said that is adorable, first of all. But how far did that move the science ahead, or did it just make the public more interested?
It did result in the very first cloned house cat that came directly out of this project, which, was an advance for science, and then some cats were cloned commercially after that. These particular scientists did not manage to get a dog. I'm not sure if what they did sort of had applications elsewhere, or if it was just sort of a wasted attempt. But it did definitely sort of raise public interest and did result in some breakthroughs, such as the first clone cat.
Well, and we probably should point out that cloning is not creating an exact copy, right?
Right. It's a genetic duplicate, and technically it's not even quite a genetic duplicate because there's a tiny little bit of DNA that comes from the egg donor, but that's another story. But it's essentially an identical twin. And so if you think about identical twins, they're not the same person, even though they have the same DNA. There are all sorts of differences. And so clones are sort of genetic replicas or close to them, but they're new individuals, they're new animals, they're not a resurrected dead pet.
Well, and there are some distinct downsides to cloning too, to the animal.
Animal welfare has been a concern since the early days of cloning. Dolly died early, and that sort of raised some questions about whether clones were healthy. It's still hard to say a whole lot because there's not a lot of data on any one clone species, but the reviews that have been done clearly have turned up some problems. In particular, clones themselves are susceptible to this, what's known as large offspring syndrome, sort of exactly what it sounds like. They're born too big, some of their organs are enlarged, they might die in infancy. This is a serious risk, but not all clones have that problem. And what the data seem to show is that if you can sort of usher a clone through these early days of its life and get it to survive, they seem to develop into healthy adults. But again, that's sort of with the caveat that there's still a lot we don't know about longevity and sort of long-term health effects.
Well, that being said, we are currently using cloning now for commercial interests.
Yes, and that is mostly being done, sort of the biggest area of growth is in livestock, and particularly in cattle. And essentially what these cattle owners want is, genetic duplicates of their best performers. So maybe they have a cow that's really excellent milk producer, and they want to try and get another one, so they'll get a clone. Or a cow that has really great musculature, and they want to duplicate it, so they get a clone. And so this is sort of how it's starting to be used. I mean, these cow owners are not slaughtering the animals for meat, so I guess I should point out that there is not really cloned hamburger out there, and that's, I guess, for two reasons. One is the FDA in the US has a voluntary moratorium on cloned meat, and the second is that these clones are just too valuable. Like, it still costs, tens of thousands of dollars to clone a cow, and it's so valuable to a farmer that it's likely to be used sort of as breeding stock, but to slaughter it would sort of be a waste of the investment. So they're not really being created for meat, at least at this point.
And that was one of the footnotes, and I loved the footnotes in the book, by the way. But I do want to point out, so, right, according to the FDA, voluntary and such, you cannot eat it, but it can be used for breeding stock. So, are we probably already eating the offspring of clones?
It's possible, and the people I talked to said it's possible. I should also point out that, first of all, the FDA and all the studies we have find that cloned meat is literally indistinguishable from non-cloned meat. Like, they put it under microscopes, they look at the muscle fibers, it does not look any different. So the FDA says that it's safe, but sort of because it knows that this is a touchy area, it has this voluntary moratorium. And so if cloned meat is safe and indistinguishable, the animals that are the offspring of clones are also safe to eat as far as we can tell. So it's possible that it's out there on the grocery shelves. I think it makes up a very, very small proportion of what might be out there. This is still not a mainstream technique, and some of these cows are sort of starting to be bred, but hasn't really infiltrated the industry yet.
Now, something else that we're using cloning for is actually there are organizations using it to protect endangered species.
That's right, and that's sort of one of the sexy topics that comes up with cloning a lot, because it's so fascinating and it seems like this win-win. The idea sounds fantastic that if animals are disappearing, like, obviously we'll just make more copies of them, problem solved. And of course it's not nearly that easy, but there are interesting ways that cloning could be used. One of the problems with a lot of endangered species is that there's not enough genetic diversity. So not only are there, say, not enough cheetahs, but the cheetahs that remain are too inbred. Their genes are too similar. Cloning obviously doesn't solve that problem because it just gives you an exact copy of animals you already have, but it can help us preserve genetic diversity. So if a cheetah is born and it dies before reproducing, or a cheetah is infertile, researchers could potentially clone it and at least sort of give its genes another shot in the gene pool. So that's one sort of proposed use for cloning in conservation.
Have we successfully cloned an extinct animal yet?
We have, but it was a very short resurrection. I think it was on the order of minutes. It was a mountain goat, a Spanish mountain goat, and she was the last of her species. Scientists knew that the species was dying out, and so they had sort of the foresight to collect some cells from her before she died. I believe she died in 1999, and they cloned her. And this new sort of mountain goat came into the world, but after, she struggled to breathe. She may have had some of those large offspring problems I talked about. It's a little bit unclear. She, then died shortly after she was born. So in some ways it was this amazing achievement, but in other ways it's this very obvious reminder of the limitations that cloning still has and how far we have to go.
This is Skeptically Speaking, and today we're talking biotech and animal modification with Emily Anthes, author of Frankenstein's Cat. Now, we've just started to touch on how biotech can help help the animals themselves, I guess, rather than just us. So, because potentially bringing back animals from extinction, I think, falls squarely into that category. But another way that that's done is through electronic tracking.
Yes, so scientists have created all sorts of new tracking devices. Wildlife tracking really sort of came into its own in the 1950s with, what you may remember or have seen, these big, bulky radio collars, and they were often sort of strapped around the necks of grizzly bears and things like that. But the technology's come a long way. Electronics, in particular, have gotten a lot smaller and more powerful. And so now you can put these tags on all sorts of creatures. It's particularly useful for marine biologists because it's very hard for them to really get insight into the day-to-day lives of the creatures they study. And the idea is that if we understand more about ocean animals and how they use their habitats, then we can make better decisions about protecting them and managing them. So one really successful project in this regard was something known as Turtle Watch. And turtles were being caught by accident by fishermen out around Hawaii. And they didn't want to catch turtles, but sometimes they would get hooked on the line. And scientists realized that they now had enough information from the turtle tags to understand on a given day where the turtles were likely to be, what parts of the ocean, what parts of the fishing ground. So now every day they issue these maps to fishermen that say, to avoid catching turtles by accident, stay out of these areas. And it's reduced the number of turtles that are sort of caught by accident and killed and harmed by these fishing practices.
Well, I have to ask, how did the animals respond to the insertion of sensors, really, into various parts of their body?
I mean, that's a real concern with tracking, in addition to the fact that the tags themselves might cause pain or discomfort or might weigh an animal down. Just the very process of being trapped and caught and handled by humans is hugely stressful. So it depends on the animal. When possible, scientists sort of anesthetize or tranquilize these creatures before they do any sort of operations, or sometimes even before they fully catch them. And the animal sort of wakes up groggy, none the wiser to the fact that this has happened. But that's not always possible.
We'll keep on the topic of helping animals, because that's far more cheerful. So, animal prosthetics. I did not know that this was a thing. Honestly, who wouldn't love that? Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories and chapters in the book. It's an area that's really just gaining steam. The idea is essentially that we now have enough experience designing human prosthetics that maybe we can take some of what we've learned and apply it to animals. And there aren't a whole lot of sort of professionals out there that just specialize in designing prosthetics for animals. Oftentimes, these are prosthetists who work with human patients all day long, 5 days a week, and they donate their nights and weekends to creating replacement limbs for injured animals. And every animal is different, and their bodies are obviously really different from our own. So a lot of these prosthetic devices for animals are sort of one-offs. They're custom created and custom engineered, but scientists have done everything from a tail for a dolphin to a flipper for a turtle to a beak for an eagle, and on and on and on.
And that's lovely. Who could be against that?
Well,
Do tell.
there's someone against everything. I mean, I guess there are some concerns sometimes that maybe you're putting an animal through too much. So would it be better to euthanize this injured animal than teach it to use this new device? So most of the time I do think it's worth it to try and give an animal a new limb and nurse them back to health. But the veterinarians I spoke to had also seen cases where they thought it wouldn't help an animal get back to their daily life, that it might cause discomfort and suffering. And so those are tough decisions to make.
Well, but then there are the nudicles. Those are something.
So those are prosthetic testicles, and they are for male dogs, obviously, who are going in to get neutered. And apparently a big worry that some owners have about neutering their dogs is that it's going to remove their sense of masculinity or give them a crisis of sexual identity. So this dog owner essentially came up with these little prosthetic balls that when the dog is being neutered, it happens in the same procedure. They just insert these sort of silicone prosthetics in their place, and the dog wakes up and looks the same. I mean, there's no research to suggest that dogs have any concept of sexual identity, and it seems like it's probably unnecessary. But at the same time, some humane societies have sort of endorsed this because it causes no harm, and it could possibly encourage some owners to neuter their pets who might not do so otherwise.
That makes sense. But as you say, it seems like there's no evidence that these aren't just beneficial to the owners, the ones who feel bad about lopping their dog's bits off.
It's alleviating the human psychic crisis, I think, and not the dogs. So
before we go any further, I do have to say something. It was really refreshing to read your book because of the amount of objectivity that you inserted. That was lovely.
Thank you.
It was very clearly oh my God, these are wonderful things that are happening, but oh, there's this.
That means a lot to me to hear, because one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because this whole area is growing so fast and it's so fascinating, but it's often covered in this sort of apocalyptic way or in just an overhyped way. And so I really thought there was a need for sort of a clear-eyed look at what do these technologies really mean? What are the questions it raises? And, you know, I have my own opinions, and I know not everyone's going to agree with them, but I hope that informing their own opinions, people at least sort of can look at the facts in a clear-eyed way. So I was hoping to give people sort of the tools to come to their own conclusions, even if they're not the same as mine.
Be reading that book, like there's so much research like this being done, and there are really solid criticisms for why we maybe shouldn't be doing this kind of thing at all, really. So after your work on the book, what do you think? You were very careful to try and take yourself out of it, but did writing Frankenstein's cat alter your opinion at all?
I'm not sure it altered it, but it definitely helped me make sense of how I felt, because when I started, I was sort of the same ball of confusion that I think a lot of people are when you just see these advances in passing. I guess what I really came out of it with a sense of is that these techniques can be used in so many different ways that it makes no sense to sort of make blanket ethical statements about them, that all genetic engineering isn't evil, all genetic engineering isn't good, that we really have to look at individual cases, and there are certainly things we can do that we might want to regulate against that will be dangerous to humans or animals or the environment. And I'm all for forbidding those applications, but there are also ways we can do good for animals or ourselves or the world with these technologies. And so I fear a little bit that if we have these emotional knee-jerk reactions against all biotech, we'll be losing out.
Emily, thank you very much for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
You'll find links to Emily Anthes and her book, Frankenstein's Cat, on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. In just a minute, guest host Rachelle Saunders talks to futurist George Dvorsky about his work seeking legal personhood for non-human animals. Stay tuned.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we're taking a look at the past, present, and future of food, and what science has to say about a popular diet trend. We're joined by biology professor Marlene Zook to talk about her new book, Paleo Fantasy, What Evolution Really Tells Us About Sex, Diet, and How We Live. And guest host Rachelle Saunders talks to Kurt van Mensvoort, director of the Next Nature Network, about the cultural implications of lab-grown meat. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm Rachelle Saunders, and I'm joined by George Dvorsky, Canadian futurist, science writer, and ethicist. He is a founding member of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, the founder and program director for the IEET's Rights of Non-Human Persons program, an initiative to see extended rights and protections granted to highly sapient animals. He is also a contributing editor at the online news blog IO9 and a blogger at Sentient Developments. Nice to have you back, George.
Thanks so much for having me again.
So you're here to talk about non-human animal personhood. That's a mouthful. What is it?
It's the recognition, or at least hopefully the recognition, that a very select group of non-human animals are in fact deserving of special rights and considerations. What would really, for all intents and purposes, be the equivalent of human rights or human rights and protections. And the first step in order to get them these sorts of protections is to designate them as being persons. And that might be somewhat of a surprise to perhaps some of the listeners who maybe have never come across this idea before, that really the feeling is that humans can only be persons and only persons can be humans. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. But what we're trying to do with the program is impart the idea that no, as a matter of fact, there's more to personhood than just humanity. And that if you look at, let's say, some of the great apes, elephants, and the cetaceans like dolphins and whales, that you are looking at, like I said, a very select group of animals who are, they have some incredible cognitive gifts, cognitive capacities, everything from self-awareness and of course, full-out conscious awareness, emotional abilities, they have relationships and intimate ties with each other, and of course they have the capacity for suffering and distress and those sorts of things. So because of these sorts of characteristics, we are, again, trying to get the legal framework set up such that we can recognize them as being persons.
So then I guess the next question is, what is the actual current definition of person?
There is no current definition of personhood or a person, and it's an area where you will have different, let's say, ethicists or philosophers or even legal scholars, even political scientists will give their own different opinion on what constitutes a person. I'm partial to, I guess, a list of criteria or a list of capacities, if you will, that would really designate what a person is. So the kinds of things that you would look for example, is a certain degree of self-awareness. So one thing that you could do, one certain test you could give to an animal is what's called the mirror test. It's a very famous test where it basically is exactly as it sounds. If an animal can recognize itself in the mirror and know that it's itself and not somebody else, that's certainly obviously one sign that they've passed that test, and it's a very potent sign that there is in fact some self-awareness happening. But there's other criteria as well. A certain threshold of intelligence, for example. There's also theory of other minds. So the animal not only has to have a sense of self, the animal also has to have a sense of there being others and being recognizing that there are others in its an environment and it can hold relationships with these other minds. Even to a certain degree, having a sense of self in the past, so having, I guess, a sense of history, and having a sense of self in the future. And having a sense of self in the future, what that really constitutes is basically understanding that there's going to be consequences to actions, and these sorts of animals will alter their behaviors accordingly, knowing that obviously that they will reap what they sow. So these are the different criteria that I like, and these, by the way, were first articulated by an ethicist and philosopher by the name of Fletcher. And like I said, these are at least a good framework for me. But one of the challenges that we do have with this program to put forth, I think, a more rigorous and a more concrete list of criteria that we can say actually do in fact constitute a person. Now, mind you, this is my particular take on it, my particular perspective. I do have colleagues that have a far more liberal interpretation when it comes to personhood, and they, for example, strictly look at things like a high degree of sapiency, a high degree of intelligence, and of course, even, to a certain degree, even emotional capacities and emotional bonds and theory of other mind type capacities, and they leave it at that, and they're content to say these animals are in fact persons.
Now, we as humans, we often tend to unduly anthropomorphize animals. We have a history of it. So are you saying that animals exhibit a lot of these traits and that we don't think this anthropomorphization, which is what a lot of times we do with animals, isn't going on here?
I mean, that's a very good question. What I would say, to be more accurate or even to be fair, is that we are both guilty of anthropomorphizing too much and sometimes too little. And we often see human characteristics or human capacities where they're not, and vice versa. And what we need to do, rather than look at it through that particular framework, is actually get down to the nitty-gritty and actually study the animals themselves. So, for example, give animals certain intelligence tests and other ways where we can evaluate their intelligence and their degree of self-awareness, rather than, let's say, just empirically stand back and try to infer just based on how they look or how they're acting the degree of their humanness or not. I'm also a big advocate of neuroscience and comparative neuroanatomy. So one great example is what are called mirror neurons in our brains, where humans have mirror neurons, and they're literally brain cells that allow us to have a sense of there being another person in our environment, another, in our case, another human. And we'd like to think that, and of course, and then by virtue of that, we're able to assign a certain amount of empathy toward that person. That's what mirror neurons do. It's the kind of thing that you like to think that you're taught. That when you're a kid, or even as a young adult, we're taught, be kind to others, feel sorry for other people, realize that other people have feelings and you shouldn't hurt those feelings, and so on. To a certain degree, that is taught. I'm not going to completely deny that. But for the most part, that is a cognitive capacity. It's something that's latent. It's something we're born with. It's something that's part of our neural architecture. And like I said, it occurs on account of mirror neurons. Well, it just so happens that when you take a look at whales, for example, and you study their brains, they have these cells that they are absolutely identical to the mirror neurons in human cells. So what that tells us, at least from an empirical perspective, is that there's a very high degree of probability that they're using these brain cells in exactly the same way we are, so that they have, again, a sense of empathy toward other whales or other individuals in their environment to the same degree that we are. And again, that can therefore then even be backed up, let's say, with observational evidence. We look at, for example, how dolphins treat other members of the pod. Even we see how dolphins not only stick up for themselves and have actually worked to rescue themselves, but there's many cases where dolphins, just strictly out of their own volition, have rescued humans, for example. So all these sorts of different factors, this confluence of factors, give us a strong indication that it's more than just anthropomorphizing, that they actually genuinely have these capacities, both in terms of their neural capacities and in terms of how we observe their behaviors.
So I'm interested in how these kinds of things would be tested with animals. So, for example, you mentioned theory of other minds. How would you go about testing that in an animal?
What you can do is watch animals play tricks on each other, believe it or not. And it's basically, I know that you know type of an attitude. So, for example, you can hide an object or play a trick on a person. Or similarly, you can create a sort of a test with chimpanzees or bonobos or however, in such a way where scientists can watch these sorts of tasks at play. So you can obviously incentivize a chimp, let's say, to want to hide something from another chimp who perhaps knows that there's an object there. So I'm struggling to come up with an exact example now, but you can imagine a scenario where, let's say, two chimps know that there's, let's say, some food somewhere. One leaves the room for a while. The other one will hide it or something like that, knowing that that he has actually tricked the other chimp. So that's a proof right there that the chimp does have a theory of another mind. In other words, he's projecting outside of his own mind, realizing that, when he returns, he's going to think that it's there, but I've removed it and I've put it somewhere else. When it comes to, let's say, elephants or cetaceans, it's a bit more challenging. I will agree, but I'm sure that's where scientists need to be creative and need to set up these sorts of tests where these sorts of things can happen. There's a wonderful article that was recently put out by Franz de Waal in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was just last weekend, where he describes many of these different tests, both in terms of their effectiveness, but more to the point of his article, more in terms of their ineffectualness. That many of these tests, he argue, are very human-centric. So I'll give you one example. They wanted to see how good a job chimpanzees do at recognizing faces. And what they decided to do was, of course, have a whole set of pages of human faces. And the reasoning behind it was that human faces are much more characteristic and unique, and that they're actually giving the chimp actually a bit of an advantage this way over looking at chimp faces, for example. Well, needless to say, the chimpanzee did absolutely terrible in the study. And the researchers concluded that, the facial recognition amongst chimpanzees is not what we thought it was, and so on and so forth. Of course, a follow-up study decided, well, wait a minute, chimpanzees are hardwired not to see human faces, they're hardwired to see chimp faces. So they redesigned the test accordingly, and of course they did spectacularly well, as well as humans could be expected to do on a similar sort of a test. So we have to be very careful as to how we set up these tests as well, and make sure that we don't, like I said, create human-centric tests and tests that also stacked against them. They test, for example, the differences between child intelligence and, let's say, the primate intelligence, or not that we're not primates, but let's say a chimpanzee intelligence. And they'll have, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old human sitting on its mother's lap, and the mother will be there, maybe directing its attention, and it's in a very safe and controlled environment. Whereas they'll perform a very similar sort of a test for a chimpanzee that's behind a cage that has no, tactile contact with anybody. He's probably scared that there's even a test happening. And needless to say, when the chimp does very poorly on a test that's supposed to measure, the comparative attributes compared to a human baby, we can see that, or a human infant, we can see that it's very much stacked against them in terms of these sorts of tests. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be wary of if we are going to in fact, measure these sorts of capacities in these animals.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and we're talking to George Dvorsky, Program Director of the Rights of Non-Human Persons program at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. Okay, so even if we were to agree that some animals do show some of the traits that we associate with humans, what does that mean for the animals that don't? Are you only proposing non-animal personhood for specific animals?
We have focused on this specific crew here. So all of the great apes, that includes chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and so on. Elephants, absolutely, and all cetaceans, which include all dolphins and whales. It's kind of a baby steps approach as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we have such a mountain ahead of us that we need to surmount in order to get the kinds of rights and protections that we're talking about for these animals, and to get the personhood designation. It's almost hard for me to even think beyond that. But assuming that we can accomplish this goal and get it done, then I absolutely will start to think about extending that even further. Because for me, as we just discussed, it's all about capacity. So I'll start to ask the question, okay, have we missed anybody? Are there any other animals out there that exhibit similar sorts of characteristics? And can we continue to start to push the envelope outwards? I have, both followers in terms of our group, and supporters and colleagues who take great exception to the exclusionary nature of what we're doing, arguing that, why don't you recognize my dog or my cat as being persons? Because they're just as much a person as, let's say, a dolphin is. And when I hear arguments like this, I have to admit that I'm somewhat sympathetic. Any one of us who have companion animals, we become very closely attached to these animals. And who's to tell us that this isn't a person, that there isn't an absolute character and a personality there with tendencies and emotions? Like, absolutely, and by all means. So I'm very much, let's say, open to the possibility that in future we will investigate the possibility of creating not necessarily persons along the lines of the persons we're talking about when it comes to, let's say, the great apes and elephants, but perhaps we can come up with something maybe comparable and start to talk more, not more along the lines of dog persons and cat persons and let's say pig persons and so on, that there is a kind of recognition of a personal autonomy there. And that we can start to think rather than just talk about a person, but rather think about it from the terms of the species itself and take it from there. So I think that's probably where we're going to take it.
That sounds really complicated. And this isn't just a philosophical exercise for you and your colleagues. You guys actually want this definition to have legal standing. So how would that work?
It's complicated, certainly, in terms of articulating our arguments and explaining what it is that we mean by a person. But then it becomes very uncomplicated, I think, once you are able to get the designation. And what I mean by that is once these animals are designated as persons, the same sorts of rights and freedoms that apply to us as humans would apply to them. And I'm not talking about, for example, the right to vote or the right to universal health care. Really what we're talking about are, I guess, what would be termed negative rights. Rather, these rights would be serving to protect them. So instantly, these animals would be free from experimentation, so it would be absolutely illegal to do any kind of experimentation on any of these animals. They would not be allowed to be confined against their own will, of course. They could not be tortured. They cannot be made to perform at things like zoos and aquariums. So any elephant performing at a zoo, that's got to go. Animals in circuses, and of course the things like marine land and those sorts of parks, they would have to either grandfather out the animals that they have, or simply find a way to rehabilitate the animals that they have in some kind of a preserved setting. One of the more, radical ramifications of this would also be anyone could not put an animal to death against its will, obviously. So that will create a whole set of complications. So, for example, let's say you had a fisherman with his fishing line was being very sloppy and managed to catch a dolphin in that fishing line. So now you suddenly would have a case where this fisherman could be potentially guilty of a kind of reckless endangerment or even a kind of a manslaughter charge. So it's going to have to be very well thought out, and we're going to have to kind of set things up to obviously protect everybody's interests. But ultimately, these are the kinds of protections that we're looking to invoke right at the get-go once personhood can be established for these animals.
I'm wondering what the response to these kinds of efforts has been. I'm assuming asking people to view animals as persons is quite difficult, but I've also read that there are at least some scientists who do agree with you.
I think that's fair. The initial reactions we do tend to be of incredulity and thinking we've gone too far. One of the most common complaints that I get right off the bat is we have our own problems to worry about. The human, we're so nasty and mean to our own species. How can we even begin to think about helping, or even helping other animals or designating them as being persons when our own house isn't in order? And my response to that is, well, why can't we do both? In a way, there's a kind of a speciesism to that particular claim, the sense that a human life is worth more, let's say, than let's say a dolphin life or a bonobo life, and so on. And I'm sure you have listeners who are going to take great exception to that statement, that say, by absolutely, human life is more valuable, and obviously that's obviously a very grounded sentiment or popular sentiment right now, and that would be, I think, our absolute most difficult challenge to overcome, is to get people to reframe things in their minds when it comes to the value of life, and recognize that there is a wider circle of moral consideration that it does include, for example, these other animals, and that we need to think about looking out for our interests as much as we need to be looking out for their interests.
George, thanks for being here and giving us a lot to think about.
Hey, my pleasure, anytime.
You can find links to George Dvorsky and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And since you're there, please do click the links to Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and iTunes. You can follow the show, download episodes, or subscribe, or even send us your show ideas. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Rachelle gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's spells, cause we're skeptically speaking, on mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks, all the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan woo. I don't think you understand, it's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor, leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Rachelle gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is, cause we're skeptically speaking.
Skeptically Speaking is produced and distributed by Suburban Panic Media. Our guest coordinators are Rachelle Saunders and Ed Haynes. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. Helen Quavillion is our publications coordinator. Ryan Bromsgrove is our production manager and assistant editor. Josh Witten is our researcher. The show is edited by K.O. Myers. Our theme song was written and recorded by A.O.K. And I'm your host, Desiree Schell.